Chapter 11. In the tiny cabin, Maisie and Annabelle helped Madison with her makeup and curled her hair as she sat fiddling her nervous fingers. She generally didn't primp, but tonight, looking her best was important. Her last kiss had been horrible. She'd stepped out of her shell and accepted a date from a man she'd met at the library. He'd pushed too far too fast, slipping her tongue on the first date. She'd never called him again after that. Tonight, she hoped she'd have one for the memory books, because nothing about Randall was in half measures. He'd kiss her like he'd done everything else, thoroughly and well. Annabelle, Maisie interrupted her thoughts. Not too much lipstick. We don't want poor Randall to spend days removing it. Remember, he doesn't have makeup remover at the end of the night. She gave a smug smile. They were so sure. Her nerves jangled to awareness just thinking about it. So, are you going to convince him to take you into Shady tonight? You aren't exactly dressed for a moonlit horseback ride. Madison ignored the blatantly suggestive comment. Maisie had returned, at least where Annabelle could hear her, back to the woman she'd always been. I don't know. He didn't say where we were going. I just wanted to look like a woman. She glanced down at her dress without tilting her head. The red and blue polka dots above the empire waist accentuated the slight curve of her chest, while the silky black skirt was made to cling to her legs in all the right ways. If he didn't see her as a woman tonight, he was blind. There, you've got curl where you need it, color where you didn't have enough, and now you just need the attitude. Annabelle stood and cocked a hip as if to give her a little of her own. I don't want to change myself, I just wanted to be pretty. She stood and swished the flowing hem of her skirt. She had dressed for dancing, but Randall didn't seem like the type. There were too many people at a bar, and she wouldn't be comfortable either, so he wouldn't take her there. Maisie tipped her head and caught her glance in the mirror as she checked her own lipstick. Well, we're going to head into town. Maybe we'll see you later. If he doesn't kiss you, I'll send over a replacement or two. We'll make him jealous. Maisie laughed, puckering her lips with a smack. Now Madison was certain she didn't want to go to Shady. Too much male attention drove Maisie and Annabelle. Danica gave her a nod of encouragement, but held her tongue until the door closed behind the two loud roommates. I know you want him to react to you, but be careful. Madison laughed. I don't think you have anything to worry about. I'm hopeful for... She didn't even want to name it, even in her head. If she did and it didn't happen, she'd be disappointed. This was one date night she wouldn't come back wishing she'd stayed at home. Danica picked up Randall's shirt and handed it to her. I assume you're going to give this back to him? Madison held it close but didn't touch it to her face so she wouldn't get makeup all over it. I don't want to, but yes. She slid it on over her dress. What do you think? Her frown could have leveled a skyscraper. You look shabby chic, but he'll probably like seeing you in his shirt. I'd better go meet him. It's almost time. Can't he come to the door? Her tone was just the same as Madison's mother would have used. Danica's words stopped her short. Yes, a gentleman would have come to her door in bygone days. But this wasn't her home, and their beds were all out in the open, right in view of the front door. I think I'd rather he not see our mess. I don't mind walking down to the corral. She waved and ducked out the door. Danica would be talking with her husband soon and would enjoy a quiet room anyway. Randall already stood out by the fence waiting for her. He always came early so she wouldn't have to wait for him. Just another thing he did to put her first. He turned as she approached, and the evening sunshine caught the surprise across his face, lighting a heat deep inside her. He looked down at his own clean but worn jeans, white tank, and blue cotton shirt, unbuttoned and hanging loosely on his shoulders. I guess I'm underdressed. What did you have in mind for tonight? She'd wanted him to like what he saw. Instead, he looked sheepish, embarrassed, out of his element, and she regretted her choice immediately. I didn't have anything in mind except you. It was honest, and she hoped he could tell. He reached for the edges of his shirt and drew her closer. You look mighty good in that shirt, but I think... With the dress. He gently pushed it over her shoulders without touching her and let the soft material slip down her arms. Every whisper of the fabric ignited her skin. They're beautiful. He stared down at her and she met his gaze. She smiled up at him and pushed his own shirt off his shoulders, exposing muscled arms. Arms that felt mighty good wrapped around her. He laughed and shook his head, tossing both of the discarded shirts over his shoulder and out of the way. How could she be so drawn to this man? He brushed her hair away from her face. I have an idea. My truck is out back. I think you need to go dancing. Her insides crashed. No. If they went to Shady, she'd see Maisie and Annabelle. But if he wanted to take her somewhere, she shouldn't rebel. He was doing it for her because she'd sent him the cue by dressing the way she had that she wanted to go somewhere. He took her hand in his and caressed it as they walked toward the ranch house. Behind it sat a short row of pickup trucks. His was clean and new, but tall. He unlocked the door and came around to open the door for her. The floor of the pickup was at least to her knees. She couldn't climb into it without showing him way more than she intended. She'd have to hitch her knee higher than her waist. He waited for a moment, then sighed. I'm sorry, I didn't even think. He pulled a bucket out of the back and turned it upside down for her to step on. It still wasn't modest, but if he'd tried to lift her into her seat with the slippery satin fabric, he'd have gotten more of an eyeful than if she'd just climbed up on her own. So much for looking like a lady. He waited until she scaled the bucket and into the cab before he closed the door, finally coming around back to his side. The cab was so huge it felt like he was sitting in another county, but it was more comfortable than she expected. He stuck the key in the ignition, pushed a few pedals on the floor, and slowly the truck rumbled to life. She shook her head. I've never driven a manual. My father wanted me to learn, but I knew even then that I'd live in the city and I'd probably never even own a car. Not a bad skill to know. If you ever want to learn, I'd be happy to teach you. He shifted the truck into reverse and laid his arm across the back of the seat, gently rubbing his thumb through her hair. If he was offering to teach her, that had to mean he was hoping for more time with her beyond the next 2 days. Wednesday and Thursday and tonight. That was really all the time they had left. He headed down the driveway, keeping his hand at her neck, and turned away from Shady. I thought you were taking me dancing. The brochure had said Shady was the closest town, but she couldn't remember any others. I am, but I don't like bars. He smiled over at her for a moment, then back at the road. The truck rumbled like a city bus under her, but there was something much more comforting about it. Even though the cab felt wide, it wasn't deep, so the longer she sat in it, the more intimate and private it felt. Randall pulled off the road but left the truck running. He turned on a country station and opened his window and hers. Then he climbed out of the pickup and came around to her side. When he opened the door, he didn't mess with the bucket. He wrapped his arm around her waist and helped her down. She was too curious to know what he had in mind to interrupt him. The area around the front of the truck was all scrub grass. He led her out into the headlights and took her into his arms, slowly swaying to the crooning music. He'd done something she'd never expected, but wholly appreciated. He'd managed to take her dancing and satisfy her need for privacy and his own. If only she could keep him. Her heart soared as he pulled her close. Her head fit just perfectly into his neck, and he smelled amazing. No overpowering men's body wash, nothing fake, just him. Just before the sunset, Madison pulled back just enough to see him, to see the heat in his eyes. His gaze never left her face. He'd waited for her to give him the cues all along, so did he need to know she wanted to kiss him? Or how would she even tell him without just taking over? That wasn't romantic in the slightest. She ran her hand down the muscles of his arms, but she wanted his lips. Her gaze fell to them. His bottom lip was full and perfect, and in that moment his arms tensed around her, drew her ever closer, sliding over the satin fabric of her dress as his mouth slowly descended on hers. He started slowly, a soft brush. When she pulled him closer, he groaned, and as she'd suspected, his kiss shattered every bad notion she'd ever had about kissing. He tasted of coffee and cinnamon. She'd never be able to have those two again and not want more of this man. His exploration of her mouth made her come alive, and she clung to him. But her body wanted more. More of him. She tugged his shirt free of his belt and raked her nails up and down his back. Randall pulled away from her, his breath barely under control. What had she done? She knew he was a Christian. Would he judge her harshly? She'd ruined everything. "I'm so sorry, Randall." She made to run back to the truck, but he gently tugged her wrist and held her in place. "Madison, I'm not mad. You don't have to apologize." He wrapped her in his arms once more, but his touch had changed. Where he'd ignited her before, now he comforted her until her raging heart calmed back to normal, following the lead of his own heart, pounding under her ear. "I could lay you down in the grass or take you to my truck right now, but then I wouldn't be any different than any other man out there. I don't want to be just any man to you, Madison." She didn't want him to either. He tipped her head until she looked him in the eyes once again and framed her face with his hands. The tenderness there brought tears to her eyes. No man had ever treated her like a cherished treasure until now. "I want your body, don't get me wrong, but I want a lot more from you first. I want your heart." She'd begun the evening thinking it would be good to get a kiss, but what he'd given her was so much more. "How, Randall? In 2 days I get back into that Durango and drive an hour to the airport, then fly for another couple hours, all the while getting farther from you. How do I give you my heart when I know I've got to leave? Especially if leaving would break the very heart she wanted to give." His fingers dove into her hair and massaged the back of her neck as he pulled her back into his comforting embrace, and she never wanted to leave it. "I don't have all the answers, and I can't ask you to stay, but I don't want you to go." They couldn't avoid separation. Her life in New York wouldn't wait. Her agent would be banging down her door if she didn't get that manuscript done by the end of the month. If she didn't, it would be her first missed deadline, and her publisher would never give her another royalty advance. Even if she did decide to move out to Wyoming to see where things might lead with Randall, she'd still have to go home and sublet her apartment, forward her mail. It wasn't like she could just disappear. And if she didn't tell Randall about Desiree, he'd never understand why she needed that life or why she had to make such demands. One of them would have to change completely, or separation was a given.